I'll start off autobiographically with this slide that you've all had quite a lot of time to see and wonder why it's on there. The lecture's not called Seaside Memories, it just happens to be the first slide. And I think I want to do, in the first phase, some background stuff of maybe, and it's always post-rationalization, maybe the reason why I do what I do is because for a lot of my youth, I was brought up at the seaside. And one of the seaside towns I lived in was a little tiny town on the east coast of England called Felixstowe. And I was bewitched by the fun fair. I didn't go into the fun fair very often, but I think even at the age of 12 or 13 when I lived there, there was something that fascinated me about that setup. And then, of course, archly now I can label what it was I was intrigued by, which was the helter-skelter, which latterly I would come to understand as some kind of megastructure, the crazy house, which I would later understand to be a sort of entree into the idea of expressionism, and a piece of Suffolk Art Deco, not maybe the greatest Art Deco in the world, but this combination of such things as megastructures, expressionism and Art Deco. Sounds like a heady mix, but it was just in this tiny town of Felixstowe. The other thing that I grew up kind of subconsciously being aware of was the existence of technology, not as some special label thing, but it was just there. In Bournemouth, where I stayed the longest on the seaside and went to the first architecture school, there is a cliff and a couple of cliff lifts. You pay a penny to go down the lift, you pay a penny to go up the lift. But that's not, and they were rather sort of Victorian objects, but they were a means of operating. And the business of having something that's mechanical, just sort of in the town or in the landscape, didn't strike me as being odd. And I accepted technology for what it was from then on. Now there were some weird things about Bournemouth. It was a town, or still is a town, where a lot of people from the sort of dirtier parts of the UK would go to retire and then find themselves living another 10 or 15 years. Nowadays it's a seaside resort with a lot of students and the highest number of nightclubs in the UK because there are a lot of students there. But it's also the repository of an enormous number of rather good neo-Gothic 19th century churches, for what it's worth. But the weird thing about the school was that it was the last place in the UK where you were taught a version of the École des Beaux-Arts academic system. You were taught to read and work from a book from the 18th century, James Gibbs' Rules for Drawing the Several Parts of Architecture. We would have to go and measure churches with bits of lead. We would have to go and reproduce drawings from 19th century grammars of ornament. We would have to go and be able to draw all the 5 orders of architecture by proportion. Now the weird thing is that actually I'd already been interested in architecture for 2 years, even before the age of 16 when I went to that school. And I will come back to that in a moment. The other thing to find in Bournemouth was this sort of Arcadian tradition, this notion of middle-class people walking in amongst the pines and then putting up discrete little strange objects. But in fact, what I'd been reading, even before going to the school, because I was an enthusiast for architecture for whatever reason, was stuff like this. I'd already seen this photograph at the age of 15 and thought, my God, it's quite unlike anything that I've seen in Bournemouth or anywhere else. It's like a biplane, it's like floating, it's like transparency. It's really, wow. And then I was having to measure these old churches, you see. Very weird. Anyhow, rescue came in getting into the AA school and going up to London, which was a combination not only of architectural input, but the kind of hedonism, I suppose, that London did represent and still does represent. Hedonism overlaid with certain pockets of indulgence. And of course I met all these guys. I think all I want to say about Archigram, which isn't always understood, is that we were 6 different individuals, 2 of them sadly dead now, differing in age from the oldest to the youngest by 10 years. No 2 from the same school of architecture. No 2 with the same taste in music, girls, dress, food. I mean, really, sometimes quite diametrically different. And dare I admit it, we didn't even know what each other's politics were, and very rarely discussed them. But we had somehow a weird respect for each other, and were prepared to gang up in 2s and 3s and 1s to do various projects. The mix of Archigram is, I think, the interesting aspect of it. Not its homogeneity. It was in a sense a coalition of different types, rather like you might get in a really good studio in a school of architecture. And out of that period came a lot of work. We were employed as our day job by a company called Taylor Woodrow Construction, who for 2 or 3 years didn't realise how we were how we were spending, how we were investigating as on the back of their money. I can remember Warren Chalk sitting in a side hut, surrounded by copies of Casabella, Domus, and Japan Architect, which I think was spending their money in an intelligent way in many ways. And then after some time, I had won a small competition, enwheeled myself to the A as a regular critic, and then they said, look, you've been coming in for 2 years as a critic, we better take you on the payroll and be done with it. Now, the point about that was that I never really had the anonymity that one should have had as the humble assistant to the 5th year master. The humble assistant is meant to walk behind the master and be very useful to students, and a little guy who goes back in a hutch. But actually, I published this thing. It had been published in the Sunday Times colour supplement, readership 1.5 million. Every student that faced me and was introduced to me as this new sort of factotum person said, oh God, we've got to study with that guy. Do we have to do that kind of stuff? Which was, I've never had this anonymity as a teacher. Whether that has shaped my teaching, I'm not quite sure, but what I did realise in that first year was that, in fact, my task, because I was already an opinionated fucker, my task was really to be an amateur psychologist, because most of the people in that elite AA 5th year needed help. They had worries, they had paranoias. And I literally hardly drew anything for about the first year because I was so engaged with this business of getting my head around people. And I think the result of that is that people have remained of considerable interest to me, more than might have met the eye. Okay, over the long, Archigram is Leslie was saying that I'm well documented, so is Archigram is extremely well documented, mostly by people who get it wrong. I have to complain about probably the most popular Archigram book, which is the one that MIT Press put out, which is all to do with the texts, and I feel that the author isn't very interested in the stuff. I wish somebody would do a stuff book about Archigram. I think the one that Routledge brought out is actually the better of the two, though the less known, but I digress. Point being that it was, from my position within the Archigram coalition, very much about stuff. In the years since, I have travelled a great deal. I've been a visiting professor in various places and have, as was pointed out, I have my ex-students and friends all over the world. But I invented a kind of little game with myself. I thought, if I had been to somewhere for a month or more, I might respond to it with a project. And the projects tended to be towers. in Oslo, in the middle of the 80s, I made a series of towers which were a commentary upon the city of Oslo and its tradition of lanterns, particularly the Nordic tradition of these because they have cheap electricity, these lanterns that usually are above sort of fascia line along the street, and they're big lanterns, they come alive, and I borrowed from the lantern tradition. And I appropriated the lanterns at the bottom as lanterns, then as kind of oriel windows, then as room-sized windows, then as apartment-sized windows, and then at the top was the whole tower. So it went from lantern, 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 lantern. In the daytime, wearing the colours of the Nordic plateau, which had been appropriated both by Nordic painters and by the Funkis architects of the 20s and 30s. Finding myself as a guest professor in Brisbane, a little later, I responded to what was then developing, and as we see in the slide on the left, is now fully developed, the Brisbane Arts Quarter on the other side of the river from the downtown. And I was interested in particularly in the tower on the right, in the notion of naturally ventilated bungalows, which you get in early Brisbane. And I thought, hey, why not pile these bungalows one upon the other? In my wife's city, which is Tel Aviv, which is a highly hedonistic city, it has to be despite the sort of political circumstance, I devised a rather hedonistic tower, which would have various wrappings within the skin. And the story goes on. For Paris, a series of apartments with a kind of English, a sort of naughty, an English garden creeping up behind them. In Tel Aviv again, on the right, building up on the natural entrepreneurship of the Tel Avivians, I make a kind of kebab stick, which has the different enterprises attached to the curb, just like the contents of a normal kebab, where the onion looks considerably different from the meat, etc. And if you look at a little slide on the top right, you'll see, in fact, it's the location for this tower, which was in the middle of a circle. It was actually Oscar Niemeyer's concept to have this ring of smart apartments and posh shops, which was built, but they never got round to building the three towers. So I thought, well, I can do that. I have not been invited to fill the circle in. I left the one in the middle, the London one, till last in description because it is London, and Corning is next bit, but it's in Hampstead, and London is damp, so the project is called Dampstead, and it consists of a water collector at the top and allowing the water to trickle slowly down the facade to encourage vegetation. Other projects, a much longer project, involved at this period Berlin, which was just at the end of being a divided city. It was called Way Out West Berlin, concerned with what happens at the end of the Kurfürstendamm, where it just sort of fizzles out. And the notion of appropriating the Wild West, in particular the cactus. And I thought if I could make an architecture out of the cactus and its sort of metamorphosis into a building, that would be an interesting thing to do. This is by way of a lead-in to the sort of architect that I might be, but then I will come back to that later. What I want to also talk about on this occasion is the situation that we are in. As I travel around the world, in particular parts of Europe, there is a sort of gloom. Maybe we're pulling out of the gloom here in Canada, I'm not sure. But in London and in Paris, and particularly in Spain, there is a sort of cynicism about the moment. And yet, that word that we use so extensively during the archigram period, cheerful, surely should come in. It's not a fashionable word, but I think we should remain cheerful. But I go through this issue a little bit here. Times are indeed difficult. That's what everybody keeps saying. Times deal with and times are difficult. And I say, well, you know, I'm old. It's official, that's on my bus pass, you know. And I was, as one is, in Sweden to receive an honorary doctorate, and there was another Englishman there called George Martin, he of Beatles fame. And we were caught by a photographer because it was raining. It was unbelievably wet. It should have been nice and cold and wet. And we were exchanging, we were looking very gloomy. And it says, as you will see in the Swedish caption, basically it's saying that. And, you know, perhaps we will all be on the streets, although I noticed that this particular lady who's on the Melbourne streets actually has quite a smart pair of shoes and bag and so on, so maybe she's only just on the streets. But, you know, business is bad. I'm back to Tel Aviv here. Here's a guy eking out a living, selling fruit on a corner. The fruit is not very good, and he tries to cheer it up by having wallpaper of good fruit. But his fruit is not very good fruit, and he's trying to sell ballpoint pens and sort of funny old alarm clocks, except there are proper shops down the road that sell proper ballpoint pens. So, you know, tragedy piled upon tragedy. And on a serious note, just a few days ago, my favourite architect died, Corindo Testa of Buenos Aires. And 3 weeks ago or so I was in Genoa, which I'd never been to before. What did they do in Genoa, which is a town which is, you know, depopulating like crazy, left behind by time? Of course, they build elaborate pieces of arts installation by Aldo Rossi, so we should bow to it, but actually it's crap. And you know, nobody goes to the opera there because it's an enormous opera house. So, I think we have to be serious. If those of you who went to the last Venice Biennale will remember the exhibit of Herzog and de Meuron, where they lined the wall of their enclosure with all the nasty comments being made about their Hamburg building by the German newspapers, because everyone hates architecture. And I have collected the faces of architects themselves because I don't think they necessarily help things. The fact that some of these guys are fascists was not coincidental. So how to respond? Right. Come out of the Tokyo subway and have a really stuff like we were having standing up around the corner just then. You know, why not? They've got jolly pigs, jolly pink pigs, and green bears, and why not? You know, eat, be merry and die. Or go out in the middle of the night in Tokyo and stop yourself. Or go to a proper stopping yourself place. I think one of these examples is Chilean and the other could be just about anywhere. And I've just come up from Los Angeles where they certainly know how to stop themselves. And you know, stop yourself. There are other ways of amusing yourself, of course. I should explain this photograph. It's in Mexico City. The occasion was the launching of a British, this is actually true, a new British vodka in Mexico City. That was 2 years ago. I've never seen this vodka anywhere. I think it was invented under a railway arch in somewhere in South America. And the girls are not blondes, I can assure you. And they're not even Mexican. They're Argentinian brunette models selling English vodka that you never see in Mexico, and the same guy who's also selling Bentley cars. I mean, one finds oneself in those sort of situations and enjoying it tremendously. More often, of course, one finds oneself in this sort of situation. particularly in Northern Europe, where a series of actually rather interesting architects, most of them were in Sweden here on that platform, most of them having flown in from England for reasons I can't quite explain, if not from Germany, and all looking serious and talking the end off a donkey, but not really solving the world's problems. Meanwhile, ladies of my close acquaintance, including my wife, seem to compare notes about shoes designed by Rem Koolhaas's nephew. But you can lose yourself in consumerism, and the best consumerist room I have ever been in, and I've been there twice now, is in the suburb, if I can say it, Shimokitazawa in Tokyo, which is a hilarious shop. It calls itself the Village Vanguard, of course spelled wrong, which sells everything from draining boards to kind of odd rubberware, to books about photography, to sort of cake makers, to pieces of material you're not quite sure whether you wiped yourself with them or wear them on the head. It is wonderful. It's a sort of Casbah to end all Casbahs. And round the corner, of course, you can go and buy a hat. Not straightforward hat. I don't think they sell straightforward hats, but you can buy hats. And a Japanese friend of ours, a very interesting professor of architecture who also writes novels, buys this hat and takes you to a sort of sleazy whiskey bar around the corner, which is the thing perhaps to do to hide away. Or to go and celebrate, as we were all doing. You wave the flag at something, you're not quite sure you're waving it at. I'm frankly not that interested. But it's a great wave. Or you escape into a funny place. You go up the Suffolk coast and escape into a house. In fact, because it's a house that was a water tower. In fact, when it was built, it was a water tower with then the housing in the black bit. But then they didn't need the water tower, so they came in the build-up, settling, burnt the windows out, and the house, which was not a house, looking like a house in a city place, became a house. I like things like that. I like the absurdity. All the absurdity of going down a gully somewhere in a posh suburb of Tokyo and hiding away in a almost floating object. Many people I know find architectural reasons for indulging when they go to Venice. It's a very nice thing to do. It's very nice to go to Venice. And you meet the right kind of people there, and it's all very nice. If you have the money, you can escape. Or you can be an eccentric and creep up a hill near Santiago in Chile and build yourself a very, very strange, spooky house. Or go back into the city and hide in a hedge. I think basically you have to get on and do something. Quit arguing and moaning. Do something. Use the computer creatively. I'm no computer buff, but these two buildings would not be possible without the manipulation of the computer. The one, the Grants building, the other, the Australian building, which I will come to shortly. Get up there and do something. Get up behind notes and start painting. Start ferreting and inventing. Start using materials you never thought that you would ever use. Encourage your students. This is a party. The party is wild, but so is the architecture going on in the building just behind it. Why not? Dive into history, but dive into your own type of history. I'm fascinated by veggies. I go everywhere to discover how veggies can incorporate into buildings. Mostly, the best examples are in Germany. The one you're seeing here is in Schwetzingen, which is near Mannheim, but you could go also to Karlsruhe, where this construction was built in the middle of the 19th century to encourage the vegetation to make the enclosure. And I didn't see it until after I'd done these drawings. One was subconsciously investigating the same territory. One of my favourite projects of my own sort of later middle period is what I call the veg house. It is a vegetated territory. The yellow plan is the enclosure, and you see already the armatures with some vegetation starting to creep in. It metamorphoses. The vegetation creeps considerably more. Areas redispose themselves, the power pack gets smaller. The vegetation increases even more and starts to take on a kind of romantic quality. And I deliberately use those old-fashioned words like glade and weave and slide and fold. And the elements of the project are hybridic. They are combinations of audio-visual elements and electronic elements and electrics and vines growing and funny itchy things that you sit on with perhaps triffids of some sort. And the project moves even further. It starts to get very, very spooky. And even more spooky, and at this point, the drawings having almost taken over the project, I said, stop. Enough is enough is enough is enough. But if you can have a veg house, you can have a veg village. You can have it sitting in amongst the water, almost suppurating, with the hydroponics creeping up and over and into the buildings. And I find the marshland, a marsh, one of the most fascinating conditions, because it is neither land nor is it water. It's somehow oscillating between the two. More recently, we made a project which was looking forward to the days when there won't be any technology hardly left, when London will have flooded, and a few survivors will be creeping up into a new kind of megastructure, which is almost like a sort of old, gnarled, do-it-yourself tree trunk. People will be surviving up into these structures, and up and floating strange things in the air that might catch the rain. But still having, I suppose, giveaway tectonic characteristics. Around the same time, we were also working on a competition in Spain, in Murcia, for an ecologically supported office tower. It was very hot in Murcia, and the techniques involved both computer control techniques and certain of the old favourites of having cold water deep in the ground and bringing the steam up and the bamboo and the layering. And we were quite successful in this competition, except that then the money ran out in Spain and it never happened. At another level, I've been more recently interested in looking at the nature of nature and the nature of the structure of nature, and whether there can, again, this hybridic issue, can there be hybrids between the veg and the constructed object? Is there even some area where the structure of the hybrids can mimic or echo the structure of architecture? Or is there architecture even hidden in the parts that don't look so tectonic? Fascinated in this slipover, this constant slipover. But one doesn't just sit and draw in Europe. One has to get out there and also contemplate very strange admixtures that you get in other cultures. And they are often extremely rich with a similar kind of admixture that one is dreaming up on a drawing in a strange way. So it's particularly irritating when you get out of the train station at Shenzhen and you find it's that terrible generic stuff that you might get anywhere. And that their future vision for their city is this of sort of the freeway, the trees, the sensible, boring buildings. I feel there's a tragedy there. What wonderful opportunity missed. And we live with a kind of imperfect situation. Admittedly, this shop in the corner of the City of London is doing rather better than the guy with the terrible fruit in Tel Aviv. But people seem to be there's a guy with neck ache
The lady with the backache happens to be my own wife. Life is hard. Not always, because there's still, if you look for it, vitality in the street, if you know where to look for it. And that vitality in the street was that which generated our project in Italy, the Town Theatre of Verbania, which we won in competition. I have to report that it's Italy. You win the competition, and in the end it don't happen. But it's still one of our favourite projects. The town has a tradition of the use of terracotta, and we don't disabuse that. Actually, the slides here will explain to you that the colour of slides I'm seeing on here is less yellow. If you imagine everything that you're seeing slightly less yellow than it is, I don't know what the technology is doing, but nothing is as yellow as you're seeing it there. Anyway, you get the general idea. In fact, we take those people performing on the steps and we incorporate it into the market. We bring the theatre onto the steps. The theatre proper, the auditorium, sure, they use it, once in a while a second-rate touring company will come up from Milan and the bourgeoisie will go to sleep in the seats. But the real theatre happens in the cafe, in the bar, on the terraces, in the old house on the right, which we turned into a gallery. And the project oozes out into the city, town. I've always been fascinated with these interstitial conditions, these sort of almost communal garden conditions, the boardwalk. This is a project again for Spain, for Pinto, near to Madrid, where one conceived of a series of buildings that would have the kiosks creeping underneath them, the sports facilities on the roofs, and the whole laceway of cross-ventilation and boardwalks. And in the model you see the kiosk creeping in under the building. And the boardwalk, after all, is a sort of more relaxed condition than a street. It's somewhere where you can just lie, you can even lie on it, you can parade on it, the flaneur can use a rollerblade or the traditional flaneur's gait, doesn't matter. And we've been looking more and more into boardwalks. We are hoping to be involved in a project in a town called Gold Coast in Australia, where we're already building, in the bringing of what we call an arts walk into that place. We've discovered some little curious pockets in this strange beach town. It's a large, to 500,000 people along the beach with a lot of lagoons. And we've discovered some activity which we want to coerce into this project. Our favourite sort of boardwalking kind of project is a bridge. We do stupid things in our office. We enter competitions that we know we're not going to win. But we do them because sometimes they're fascinating. And even, as I say, in the odd case you win them, they don't build it anyhow. But anyhow. We had a competition in Skopje about 4 years ago for a footbridge. And Gavin Rowbottom, my partner, was up for it. We said, okay, we'll do this footbridge. We managed to convene a very, very good firm of engineers called Bureau Happold, quite famous. They did this structure. And I said, because I'm fascinated by kiosks, I said, hey, let's cheer it up. Let's put a kiosk in the middle of the footbridge. And then Gavin said, why don't we make the kiosk move? Liven it up a bit. And then I said, why don't we put a bar on top of the kiosk? So that at night, the kids can still buy their choc ices, but then the steps will come down like off an airplane, and you can go and have a glass of Slivovitz and look at the river. Needless to say, we didn't win the competition. But we still think I bring it into every lecture I can possibly think of, because I'm sure there's somebody out there somewhere who wants a bridge with a kiosk that moves with a bar on top, or something along those lines. We'll do it without the bridge if you insist. I suppose we do it without the bar, if you insist, but whether we could do it without the kiosks that move, and, you know, and per many three characteristics. In fact, I was, of all places, talking about this in Tokyo, and a voice from the back said, "They built a concrete footbridge." It was somebody from Skopje in Tokyo, but he knew that of course they were going to build this terrible concrete. I like collecting stuff for my own purposes. I was in one of my favourite places in the world, which is Santa Monica, and I got up at 7 o'clock in the morning to buy the English newspaper, as one does, and the bloke was wearing an animal on his head. What did I do? I tried to photograph it rather bad, and then rushed to the hotel, rushed to my laptop, and emailed my friend Maya Coletti in London. And I said, "There's a guy doing your thing." Because in fact, Maya Coletti, when he was first my student, had animals on his head, of course. And he emailed back right away and said, "Actually, there's a third guy I know about with animals on his head. I suggest this to any pursuer of a new subject for PhD thesis, of the stream of animals on the head." In fact, Maya has gone on to become a distinguished professor and to do some extraordinary computer work. But the animal, if you trace his work, the Animals on the Head project led to all the rest. We've all been there in a funny way. I did kind of stupid things about, you know, communications on the head would have driven one's eyes blind. But in fact, a lot of it is real. And I go around giving lectures, as you know, and a delightful young woman came up about 6 years ago in Vienna, and she gave me an address. I didn't know what quite the implication was, but I went to the address, and in fact, in the shop window, that was it, was sausage urbanism. And I recommend sausage urbanism to anybody who's doing urban projects and has run out of ideas. And I think that, though, to be semi-serious for a moment, I think there's a whole tradition in our country for this daft invention thing. The work of Heath Robinson, who was prominent in the 1920s, used to invent these rather sometimes offensive but quite amazing things. I believe, and there's another PhD thesis here for you, to link the work of Heath Robinson, the bouncing bomb, and the British high-tech movement. And you could actually do that, but I would need a lot of time to explain it. Why? This thing of the guy that goes into a hut for weeks, comes out white-faced and says, "I think it works, but we need more string." That whole kind of tradition. Not that we necessarily have a prerogative of such daftness. I was in a place called Valparaiso a few months ago, and as usual was taking a picture of a kiosk. And the owner of the kiosk, seeing me do this, I don't know if you can see it in the photo, but he brought his dog from underneath, put it in the kiosk so that I would photograph the kiosk as if it were being run by the dog. And I thought, wow, that's English sense of humour for you, but it's in Valparaiso, Chile. In our work, we enjoy colour. This is a project for Birmingham New Street Station. We did not win the competition. A rather colourless project did. But our notion was to face the building around, so the red would be facing a rather terracotta street, the blue would be facing the late lamented Jan Kaplitzky's department store, the yellow would be facing the sun, and so on. We could sort of contrive it so that there was very often a bounce back from what was surrounding, but we didn't win the competition. In another failed competition in Taipei, for a music strip, about a third of a kilometre long, in the foreground here, to the left, you see the city. It's not as yellow as that. I'm sorry, bit less yellow. In the foreground, the steel-like buildings are facing the city. In the back, as you go down the strip, you pass some spooky stuff, and gradually it gets lighter, it becomes monochrome. But the physiognomy of the buildings does the reverse. We start with stiff buildings, and as they become less coloured, they in fact become more formulated, so they become exotic in another way. And I suppose what one was doing, apart from trying to respond to the written programme, was to test the ability of architecture to metamorphose, not necessarily through time, but by formality. If you have a long project like that, with a series of pavilions, you can actually play a kind of progression between the pavilions. In other occasions, I've looked into colour as an idea of surface and, of course, the incorporation of vegetation. And one has preferences in colour, such as blue, which was the first piece of housing that I made with Christine. And this blue building in Madrid, you will recognise borrowings from the earlier scheme, the notion of lifting the building up, putting the kiosk and the activity underneath it, and in this stage, putting also the sports facilities on the top. So you would have like a kind of kebab, where, like a hamburger, where if you count the solid bun as being the underground car parking and housing, the kiosks as the filling, and the sports as the topping. Didn't quite turn, as you know, Spain's broke. The building started, reached the third floor, and then it was just almost abandoned with a guy and a dog on the side, the dog being the only piece of activity really. And then rescue in the shape of, because the builder had gone bankrupt. It's an official city job, so they wanted to finish it. And they found somebody in Barcelona who would finish it. And there it is. It's not as blue. There's no sport. Nobody can afford to operate the kiosks. But they are good apartments, and there are 100 families living in them. So in a sense, one is faced with this intriguing question. Did it happen? Did it mostly happen? How much different would it have been if the nice bits had been afforded? Will they ever happen to it? Or is it just legit planned work and the people are housed? I don't know. I'm intrigued by the question. I have to face that question. And the cores are white because you bring the light in and the wind in. Well, back to the kiosk. The generic modernist kiosk comes at the end of a boulevard. The boulevard, the trees, the bourgeoisie with the dogs, and always at the end you have the little rounded corner kiosk. And this is one in Frankfurt. Frankfurt, which is after all a very buoyant town, a rich town, in Germany, the success of Europe. But it doesn't look very happy. In fact, if you try and buy a bottle of milk or a bottle of wine from the guy inside, very sad, reluctant, and there's some old guy farting outside. Strange. Whereas I go to the troubled city of Tel Aviv, same boulevard, same dogs, same row of trees, same rounded corner kiosks, same generic type. And there's this amazing guy doing wonderful trade. Great fruit. Fantastic. Always a queue. Don't believe what you read in the newspapers. Things really aren't so bad. And just to add a little twist to it, he is round the next corner from the guy with the crap fruit. There aren't any other guys selling anything. There's this marvellous guy, enterprising, proper kiosk, He doesn't need to sell ballpoint pens. At this point I move on to some more stuff. screen. I can get the next one. So, not as yellow as it is on the screen, but when we did the Grants building 10 years ago, of course it was the attack of the blobs. This is what the British said. The attack of the blobs, what's this weird stuff coming on, blobby, blobby, blob. And the Germans had the große blob. And there was even a wonderful conference, I wish I had the slide, called Blobmaster. I love that. The Blobmaster. What a combo. We do, I will reveal, have a very legitimate history of the blob in England. We have, in the 19th century, the most wonderful blob building. And we have the TV character, Mr. Blobby. The blob can stick its bum out into an unsuspecting grass street. It can live as a nice old chap, a nice animal. He sits in the basket provided by Grants. He's friendly, he's not obsessive, you know. And he has his antecedents. If you look at the top of those church towers, you find that there was a blob architecture going on all those years before. It's made possible by a very simplistic idea of the pin and the skin. The pin is the travelator, the skin wraps around. That's all it does. You go up and you're met with surprise. The plan designed itself. Fortunately, both Colin Fournier and I knew the town very well, and therefore we knew where to put the essential partie. We had, of course, if you look at the left-hand part of the plan, we had to incorporate this very inherited tradition, sort of piece of local tradition called the Eisner's house, the metal house, but I'll come on to that. And on the upper floors, the pin simply enters the chamber defined by the skin. There was a certain amount of sight, it disposed itself, it left you a certain space, and you just poured the blob into it. It disappeared from the ground into an unknown place, whilst your friends continued to eat underneath. And it has proved to be the generator of a lot of installations. Some, just happens to be SolidWorks, but there are a lot of Eliasson has done installations. A lot of people have done installations very particularly inspired by the, I suppose, idiosyncratic nature of the building. And there are certain ideas that we incorporated into it which are less known, such as a preoccupation of mine for many years about the idea of moving from translucency to density, or from transparency to translucency to density. Yet, in a way, it is a traditional building. The pieces of plastic are, after all, laid there by hand and have to sort of fit together just as much as the tiles in the foreground. And it reflects the city beyond. In fact, if you look up the naughty nozzle, the one that doesn't play it correctly, you see the castle, the best exhibit in the building. And the interstitial spaces are something which, if I could build more, as I started to build, I discovered that these interstitial spaces are actually a really interesting aspect that you can't predict through drawings or models. And at night, the 920 pixels of light with 100 different variations of intensity can give you a film, a reading of the city, or can be featured by some artist or designer coming in programming, so that the building wears this thing on its sleeve. And what I also like is the fact that it wears it undulating. It's not in a sort of fixed screen of pixels. It's almost like body art to the building. Impossible without the use of the computer. It would have been impossible on time and on budget, which it virtually was, without the use of the computer. We might, in archigram times, have thought of something that vaguely was that kind of thing, but it wouldn't have been able to be made. Getting preoccupied, though, with certain aspects from before, I would say that the run of projects that we did for the Tai Chung Tower has certain antecedents way back in that 1963 tower. The notion of the tower as an armature, and then you hang things on it, rather like on a sort of close on a coat rack. And in this case, we were interested in hanging the idea of developing algae, growing algae on this public tower, having these sacs where the algae would be fermenting and being turned into biofuel. In the second iteration of the project, we got into more detail with the apparatus to create biofuel. And in the third iteration of the project, we used both that technology, and we were also beginning to be interested in harnessing wind and, of course, solar energy. And the thing becomes a series of manipulated panels that hang off in the sky and drift down into the park below. Carrying again on this coat hanger, if you like, a series of small sub-buildings, laboratories, wedding chapels, restaurants, places for growing the biofuel within the armature of the tower. And it tumbles from the sky down into the park. In Vienna, in the Prater, near to the Prater, famous wheel, we were in a competition, a three-stage competition, which we in the end won for the law faculty. And I started doing cartoons around that time. I suggested in this cartoon that the kind of ways of the Viennese, which I know rather well, could perhaps happen within a university building. Why should it all happen outside? It's a very preposterous suggestion that people going off into a room, there's drunks under the table, there's a large number of bottles, but why not try and keep people in the university? This was submitted as part of the presentation. Strange enough, we still won the competition. It's our largest building to date. It's 270 meters from end to end. In fact, it's two buildings: the law faculty per se, and the red thing, which is the central administration building. And I can report that it's nearly finished. It's a coloured building with screening of sunbreakers, which act like a kind of one of those sort of people who don't shave deliberately, have a sheep growth on it. And at night it rolls across the campus. We have what we call Sunshine Corner. The notion of the plan was to bring sun in and to have these nooks and crannies that would not be just part of the curriculum activities, but would be places where you'd hang out at all sorts of times. They're marked here on this plan with the sort of coloured X's, the places where you can actually hang out. And though there always, in all such buildings, there's a certain amount of value engineering, it's been hung on to. And the building has the growth and the colours and is 95% constructed now. It will open for next academic year. And I think the library, which these are rather old pictures, I haven't got recent pictures of the interior of the library. The library is going to be a particularly interesting part where in the plan you see it has sort of bridges and capsules which are not pink, actually it's a variety of different colours, and then the gardening moving over the top of the library and down into the Prater Gardens. And it is a striped coloured building. Darker stripes near the ground and lighter stripes near the sky. In Valparaiso, I found that there was housing blocks that had actually used the same coloration, but I never knew about that when I did the scheme, although if I trace back long enough in my own work, I've been fascinated by this notion of the coloured striations for quite a long time. We're now making furniture for both the park some part of the furniture for the Vienna building, and all of the furniture for the next building, which is in Australia. After all, I've been teaching a hell of a long time. So when we entered and won a competition for an architecture school in Queensland, Australia, in a way one wasn't necessarily designing the building from the book. One was designing it from all sorts of anecdotal information, and I was persuaded by my younger colleagues to do lots of cartoons. They said, do some more cartoons. No, do some more cartoons. Again, we submitted the cartoons with the entry, and we still won the competition. This is a favourite of my colleagues because of the caption, where there's some pompous part of a young know-all critic saying, I question your terms of reference, Barbara. And Barbara's friend Joe is kind of trying to pin up, is really getting nervous, and it's the other guy with the electrical contraption on the floor, which of course isn't going to work. I've been there so many times, and I've just been less than a week ago at 2 days of crits at SciArt, and indeed, life imitates art. I was suggesting in another cartoon that, of course, the international world of touring academics would be passing through Bond University. I said, it won't be back to Princeton until the 18th. And another vignette which is all too prevalent, where some sort of overeducated shitfaces saying, look guys, you have to accept this is the point of departure. And there's this poor old, mature student guy sitting there who's mortgaged his house in order to do a master's degree. Oh my God, is it really worth it? But again, as with the other project, one wants to encourage people to use the university at all times of the day and night. Cat and mouse, as a member of faculty, so particularly if you're a senior member of faculty, you take a new room and you say, is there a means of escape? If somebody boring is coming my way, can I get the hell out? But that's cat avoiding mouse, but here is mouse in the usual role of avoiding cat. The Jules, who's it's a beach town. Jules suddenly appeared in the building just to probably collect something, and the chief beaker said, nice to see you in the building, Jules. And the other younger member of faculty said, oh God, disappeared in the corner. It is, after all, a university is, after all, a place of social interchange. And I suggest that this guy probably doesn't stand much chance with the girl, but he's going to try and stay late and see what happens. And I think one of the things that endeared our project to the juror, the academic part of the jury, was that it could be used, that they could see it being used as a kind of venue, not just spotty architecture students there, but actually other things going on. It's one of Gavin's sketches that shows the relationship of the upper part to the lower part, and things going on in the way that the building works. And, again, I say it is a place of social interchange. But symbolically, this cartoon suggests that in the best teaching, it's not a question of saying black and white, but probably tweaking. And after this little drawing was done, in fact, we have spent the last 2 years tweaking to make the building cheaper, better. The tweaking usually improves the thing. What is the building about? It is a street with the more particular activities on one side of the street, mostly to do with administration and computing, and the looser activities on behind these scoop-like shapes, and we call them the scoops. The scoops are the primary structure. They are enclosures that are not curriculum enclosed. They're for people to just suddenly decide to use them, maybe have a bit of a crib, have a bit of a conversation, have a few beers, just sit, just listen, gossip, whatever. And then behind, to the bottom of the drawing, are actually the studio areas on 2 levels. The scoops also collect the light. You're in Queensland, it gets very bright, so you don't want there to be strong sunlight. You want to reflect the light down. And there we see the entrance also marked by a nose that sticks out towards the rest of the university and enter under the nose. That's the view from the pathway. And the view down the street is, let's face it, quite heroic. It is in the end, despite my sort of nonchalant talk, it is actually quite a, I suppose, consciously architectural building, with a number of different, don't get variations in the condition of light. And you saw that early drawing where the computers used to use standard pieces of shuttering but manipulate it in different ways. So you get each scoop actually being different. You can scribble, and Gavin, my partner, is a wonderful scribbler, wonderful design. But once the hole is dug in the Queensland soil, that's it. It rises up, and you have to manipulate around the scoops. You have to sometimes introduce materials other than the concrete. And I think the atmosphere will be quite an interesting atmosphere within that building. It's quite a little bit spooky. I don't mind. There's not a lot of spooky in Queensland. It could be a bit of spooky. And the nose creeps out into the rest of it. The campus is really behind us in the picture, most of the campus. And I can report that the nose is already there. The street is appearing. The scoops are there. It's happening, which for us is wonderful to see this scoopy building happen. And in fact, it will be finished within days of the Vienna building. It's quite odd, the Vienna building is taking longer, but it's much larger. And the 2 buildings come to completion. Their opening days are 6 days apart. We're interested in pursuing the furniture we've made in Shenzhen, as a matter of fact, because 300 pieces of furniture with a whole series of interlocking devices and ways of reusing the same jigs. And these lock into the building. And we've suddenly discovered this sort of role of furniture design, which we never set out to do. But the manner, I have to admit that the mannerism of the furniture, I think, recalls the mannerism of the 2 buildings, if not some other stuff. And now the roof goes on, and we look forward. What was I doing when I was standing up with the roller? I was actually constructing something exactly a year ago at SARC in Los Angeles. It was a place where I invoked an interest of mine in the idea of architecture as being comfortable. The project is called Comfo Veg. You see the computer version of it, and you see the actual installed version of the Comfo Veg. And in fact, it was extremely comfortable. A whole lot of students have taken grabbed the comfortable part and re-erected it in a series of apartments. And there they were, enjoying comfort. In fact, I was told that after I left, there was some very naughty comfort for which it is not entirely suitable. And in fact, it was based on about 3 or 4 years before a project I drew called Comfo Veg Club. Rather like a reinvention of the veg house, the idea of comfort, vegetation, electronic equipment, and a club. You could loll around. The scene is rather more exotic than we had in SIOP. But I did something then which I've not had the privilege of being able to do before, which is it started off as a sort of abstracted, painted idea, very evocative. Then there's the actual practicality of doing it on actually real, for a small budget, including me painting part of the wall. And then making a further drawing back to the idea of the Cupford Bench Club, using the part that has been constructed to then trigger the next. I'm not sure. It's nice to draw, to do something a little different, and then to draw again on top of that. Just a quick survey of some other jollies that we've done. Coloured jollies in 2012. We won a competition for the Peruvians and built them a strange sort of travelling exhibition. My wife and I have developed our own tables, the KISS table, which is a main table that then extends itself for large groups of people. The yellow thing is an exhibit we had in Tel Aviv where the table was literally turned, and a local outfit who do CAD-CAM cutting did a beautiful, beautiful version. And finally, a funny one, which has just cropped up. I got the phone call less than a month ago from my old school in the provinces, in the seaside in Bournemouth, which has now become very different from when I was there. It's actually become its own arts university, very successful in particularly film and television design. And they asked me to do a small building dedicated to drawing, back in the town where I learned to draw. So I have a great sentimentality. But this is a rather bad photo taken with an iPhone, not as yellow as that, of course, where I will shortly discuss each of it, not now, but for the next time I do this lecture, discuss all these characters. Each character is a little bit loaded as a type of personality, so it's a semi-cartoon that becomes part of actually a drawing of what the building is about. And we put the project simultaneously as handmade models, which I do, and we put it on the computer and roll it around, which others do. Not as yellow as that. And the model is still ongoing, but we're homing in now. We've got the timber specialist on the case. We'll have this one there within probably the next 2 or 3 months. I mean, there in terms of design, and probably on the ground within the next year. I'm still doing a bit of teaching here and there. I go to Paris every second week, my wife, and teach. We have brilliant students. We still produce extraordinary, exotic students. And we keep ourselves amused. Not quite as yellow as that, but I keep turning and thinking, my God, it's not as yellow as this projection. You get the general idea. And we have discussion. You can notice the furniture is in fact what we call crab tables, which were actually cut by Gavin and I personally with the jigsaw and painted. But now we're getting them manufactured, and we have this big exotic table in the middle of the studio called the Island, which takes all sorts of different activities around and has holes in it which were meant to take computer cables, but everybody seems to use a laptop, as happens. Anyway, you can find out more. Thank you.